Awesome.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Mark. Great to see you all on our second Connects meeting of 2021. This is absolutely fantastic. The attendance is brilliant. We're getting more and more people interested in this, which is fabulous. Three of us started this nearly 12 months ago now. We never dreamt it would go on this long, but unfortunately it is doing. And I think there is actually a need for this even after lockdown. Probably not so often, but every now and then it's great to just get together in the digital world. It's working fantastic. Mark has done a fantastic article about what happens behind the scenes on these events, which will be in the newsletter this month when Don gets his finger out and gets it out to you. And it's really good. Last year, when there was just the three of us, there was some air raising days. There was one event when Marcus House was running the meeting from his car in a traffic jam on the M1. You just don't know where these guys are when they're on these events. I don't know whether Mark's in Southend where he lives or whether he's in his restaurant in Liverpool. He looks like he's up in the stars. He'll be having a good time. Yeah, as Mark said, we've got a bigger committee now because things have got bigger and there's more demand for this, so we're doing them more often. We've got a fantastic team of guys, and it's the old story. I didn't realise till last night, actually, till I looked around the screen, all the guys on the committee, all of us are still working. So if you want something done, ask a busy person. It's the usual case. I'm back to doing about seven days a week Zooming. This is my second Zoom meeting today. I was on with a beautiful, positive group of guys at lunchtime, Loughborough 41 Club. Two members in the mid-90s and the rest of them late 80s. They'd all had the jab. And what lovely, positive guys these guys were. One of them was watching the cricket on his phone at the same time. So I was able to plug the connects then about the cricket. Brilliant. And I said, unfortunately, which most of you know now, but Aviemore has been cancelled and we're looking at going electronic. And all these old guys said, oh, we'll come on. And then they were arguing who was going to be the voting delegate. Brilliant. So I don't want any gatekeepers getting in touch with me anymore saying they can't have meetings because they're too old. It's just not true. Anyway, where are we? Without further ado, Steve will be announcing the February events later on in the meeting. I will hand over to Steve now, who's going to introduce our speaker tonight, who is Barry Derman's lookalike. He does all his stunt tricks for him. So I'll hand over to Steve now. Steve.
Right, evening, gents. I think Peter's stolen one of the lines there that I was going to use. It really gives me great pleasure to introduce Terry, who was our national president in 2015 and 16, to talk about his life on wheels. Terry has been a lifelong enthusiast of motorcycles and classic cars, and his knowledge of motorcycles is second to none. I can certainly testify that because a couple of years ago, Terry ran the inaugural 41 Club motorcycle rally. One of the highlights of the event was to visit the National Motorcycle Museum. And I kid you not, Terry acted as the guide for most people, and he practically knew the history of every machine there. So Terry, I know you're going to give us a brilliant talk about motorcycles and classic cars. So over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that very eloquent introduction. Good evening, gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here with you this evening, and I've been really looking forward to it since Steve asked me a few days ago. As you heard Mark say, this is going to be an interactive presentation, so please put some questions in the chat if you have them, or some comments, and we'll get to those. I'm going to throw in a few quiz questions for you, for those buffs out there for cars and motorcycles, only for a bit of fun, but I'll give you, there's no prizes, but I'll give you the answers afterwards. I'm going to start with a bit about my grandfather and then something about my father, because they both had a lifelong association with the motor trade in the Oxford area, which is where I come from. Of course, a city associated with car manufacturer for more than a century now. Then I'm going to talk about my passion for classic motorcycles and more recently classic cars, which I know far less about. However, I'm sure there's a few experts out there. So if I don't know the answer, I'm going to ask the audience. So, okay, let's get on with it. Mark, would you like to put up the first slide, please?
There we go.
Yeah, okay, straight into the first one, please, Mark. Thank you.
There we go.
Okay, there we go. As I said, I'm going to start with my grandfather, and there he is, Reginald F. Cooper. That's particularly pertinent with the bicycle, because my grandfather, who was born in Oxford, he was actually born in the rooms above a stables in a horse yard behind a pub. He had an elder brother, an elder half brother, but he was abandoned by them. They were both abandoned by their mother, left in a house in a poor part of Oxford, and adopted by the next door neighbour who took them in. She had 8 children and she took them in and brought them up as one of their own. He was a keen cyclist, and as you can see, that's an ordinary bicycle, as they used to call them. That was the name of them at the turn of the century. But that bicycle is a really important part of his life, because he had a job as a mail coach driver, driving the mail from Oxford to Chipping Norton every day. And when he met my grandmother, who was in service, you know, she was a housemaid. She lived in the same road as he was lodging in. So he used to go drive the coach and horses 18 miles to Chipping Norton, then get on that bicycle, ride back again to walk her to work. And I can assure you, it must be love. They were married on Christmas Day in 1913 by special license. He then went on to become a chauffeur to a doctor who had a Renault car, and that's where he learned to be a mechanic. And he was a very good mechanic, went on to become an engineer. He had a 1913 TT-BSA, which is a direct belt drive motorcycle. We'll talk more about those later. But he was in the Royal Flying Corps during the First World War as a mechanic working on aero engines. And I've got this brilliant picture of him stood on the float of a seaplane in the Solent with all his tools tied to a piece of rope round his waist. Goodness knows what would have happened if he'd slipped into the water. He'd have sunk like a stone, because he got about half 100 weight of steel hung around his waist. Can I have the next slide, please, Mark?
Of course.
Thank you very much. I go on to, because there he is in later life, and he was the head tester. He went to work for Morris Motors, that's where Morris Cars, Lord Nuffield, and he was the head tester of the repair shop. Because in those days, if you bought a Morris car, you could take it back to the factory to have it serviced, or if you had a problem with it, the factory would solve it. And it was my grandfather's job to take you out in the car, find out what the problem was, and then test it for you afterwards. So could we have the next slide, please, Mark? Wonderful. Okay. That's my dad. Now, Dad came along, I understand, sometime later on in 1914. And as you can see from that, that's a picture taken in the 30s. And if you can't read the name on the tank, it says Dunout. And Dunout was a make of motorcycle. They produced their own engines. They produced a 2-stroke engine with a second cylinder that was used as a pumping cylinder, but they also used proprietary engines, and that isn't a 2-stroke, that's a 4-stroke overhead valve engine in there. And my father is sat round behind the house of where my mother was born, and in fact I know that exactly to be the location, because I recognize the gates, because I remember those gates as a child when I used to go and visit my grandmother. Dad served his time as an apprentice under his father at the repair shop in Morris's, and he had 8 motorcycles. He started off when he was 14, because you could ride a motorcycle when you were 14. He started off riding a Douglas. Douglas was made in Kingswood, and for those of you that don't know, they were mainly 350 cc's, and they had engines. The engine was fore and aft. It was a flat twin engine, fore and aft. but Dad always said that his most fantastic vehicle that he ever owned was a Morgan three-wheeler, and it was a Morgan Aero with a 1000cc V-twin Jap engine. I'm going to talk about Jap later, so we just use those initials Jap for the time being, with a V-twin 1000cc V-twin Jap engine. In those days, the Morgans only had 2 speeds because it was reckoned that you didn't need anything than 2-speed gearbox. And I said to Dad one day, he said, "Oh, it was a lovely car." And I said, "Well, so what was it like, Dad?" He said, "Oh, the 2 speeds." He said it was fast and going like the clappers. And apparently he had to get rid of it because the oil, there was a sight glass on the dash of the Morgan, where often you get those on motorcycles and early cars, where you could see the oil coursing through to go into the engine. And apparently that burst one afternoon when Mother was in the car, and the oil sprayed up her dress and she refused to get in it anymore. So he had to get rid of it. Could we have the next slide, please, Mark? Thank you. This is a later slide of my grandfather. He stayed in the motor trade and he worked up until he was 82 years old. And that was his last car. And that's for those of you, if somebody like to put in the chat what it might be. Anybody put anything in the chat? Anybody recognize what that might be?
A35.
So it's an A30. So you're very close. The only difference is that the size of the rear window. The A35 had a big rear window. The A30 had a small rear window. My grandfather actually taught me to drive in that car. And I always remember going out with him. He was an incredibly calm man. And you can imagine you'd have to be. I see, Barry, you had an A35 van. Yes, great. Because it was good that Barry was mentioned, because it's lovely to have my older brother supporting me this evening. So it's great to see that. So that's great. You can also see that badge on the front of the car was a V for veteran motorists, and both him and my father were veteran motorists. Next slide, please, Mark. Okay, you can't see the face, but that's my dad, and that's Ayr Back Garden where I was brought up. And the shed that you can see behind there was actually, Dad was in the army until 1952. And he used that Norton to ride every day from Oxford to Bicester Garrison, where he was a sergeant major in Remy. And that shed was actually a packing case from a Willis Jeep that was acquired somewhere along the line. And that was the shed in Ayr Garden. And as I say, that was Dad's last bike. He had an absolute passion for Nortons. And that is a 1949 ES2, 500cc overhead valve. And he absolutely loved it. And as you'll hear later, his passions for Nortons rubbed off onto me as well. Right, I'm going to throw, before I get to the next slide, I'm going to throw in now a quick quiz question. And the first question I've got for you guys is, who holds the record for the highest number of TT wins pre-Second World War? Pre-Second World War, pre-1939, who holds the record for the highest number of TT wins? Okay, Mark, next slide, please. Great. And this is the last slide before I move away from my father and grandfather. This was my dad's pride and joy. He chose the number plate because it was his father's, my grandfather's initials. And this is one of the very first 997 Morris Coopers, because when the Cooper originally came out, as you know, the name Cooper comes from John Cooper, who was a very successful designer of racing cars in the 50s. And he knew Alec Isigonis that designed the Mini. They used to race together at Brooklands, so they were good friends. And so Isigonis needed a Mini souping up, so he went to speak to John Cooper, who souped the Mini up, put twin carbs on it, and overboard it from its 850 to 997. There's very few of the early Mark I Coopers out there, because they very soon changed to 998. And then, of course, they bored out to 1071 and then 1275. I think there was an 1198 in there somewhere. But that was Dad's pride and joy. As you can see, it had very much 60s accessories on it. It was bought brand new in 1963. And all those accessories are very period from the time. I took my test in it, which was quite unusual in those days to take your test in a Mini Cooper. He let me take it out once after I passed my test. I brought it back. He lifted the bonnet. He put his hand on the engine and he said, "I think it's time you got your own car." So that was that. Right. So that's enough about my father and grandfather, other than you can see where my passion from cars and motorcycles come from. So would you like to put up the next slide, please, please, Mark? Okay, right. You probably don't need to guess who sat on the back of that Triumph. Can anybody though guess what the Triumph is? That isn't part of the quiz question, but well, somebody might know. Now, I remember from the age of 4 being passionate about motorcycles, and I remember it because my uncle, who was an insurance agent for the Wesleyan and General Insurance Company, used to collect his rounds on a BSA A10 and a double adult sidecar. That was his everyday transport, was a 650 BSA and this big sidecar. And he used to take me from where I lived in Oxford to see my cousins that lived in a small village outside of Oxford. It was about 10 miles. And I remember them picking me up for the first time and in putting me in the back of the sidecar, right by the exhaust of this A10. And I absolutely loved it. And it was from that day on that I got a passion for motorcycles. Of course, it was brilliant being brought up in the 50s and early 60s because almost everybody rode a motorcycle. They were the most commonest thing. You know, people used them for work. People couldn't afford cars really until the Mini came along. And so everybody had a motorcycle. That is my next door neighbour called Robert. And that's me sat on the back. Okay, anybody said what the Triumph is? It's not a Bonneville. Sadly, it's a Triumph 21, T21. Well done, Derek. It's a Triumph T21. 350cc, you know, I remember Rob used to love it, and he used to take me down to the corner of the road. No crash helmet. The guy across the road had a Norton. The guy 2 doors up had an Excelsior. So many people rode motorcycles during that time. So it was great to be a youngster. Then, of course, Dad, who was a motor mechanic, got me an old moped, which he helped me get going. And I used to thrash that around the garden and take it up to the fields to ride it. And then as I came up towards about 14 years old, I suppose, together with a couple of friends, a Saturday treat was to ride into the centre of Oxford and do the motorcycle dealers. Every Saturday we'd go up into Oxford, and in those days there were 5 main motorcycle dealers in Oxford spread over the city centre. But the most famous of which, and the one that I enjoyed most, was King's Motors. Now, it was King's of Oxford. There was also a King's of Birmingham, for those of you that will remember that. And of course, King's Motors, where the sales director was none other than one Halewood, Stan Halewood, that was Mike Halewood's father, famous road racer Mike Halewood. I'm sure most of you would have heard of Mike Halewood. But because Stan had an accident pre-war, he was known as Hoppy because he walked with a limp. And my dad knew him quite well. And he also knew Mike Halewood. I think my dad knew almost everybody. Yeah, Kings were also in Manchester. Thank you, Alan. That's absolutely amazing. So, and yes, we used to go on our racing bikes, and we'd always end up at Kings because they said that they had 200 used motorcycles in stock. And it was on the first floor. They had a lift to take the bikes up and down. And they had a first floor with all these bikes in lines. There were 6 rows of bikes. They went between 2 streets in Oxford. So they had entrances at both ends, a back and front entrance in 2 streets. And across the top floor were all these motorcycles. And us kids used to go up there and sit on them all in turn until eventually one of the sales team used to come out and say, if you boys got nothing better to do on a Saturday morning. And of course we didn't have. And I can still remember the smell. It had that wonderful smell of a sort of floor cleaner and leather and rubber from the tires and oil. That was the overwhelming smell. I can still smell. Sometimes I think I can still smell Kings. It was absolutely amazing. When we'd done that, we used to go and get a coffee at the Wimpy Bar, and then we would ride home again. Now, I mentioned the Wimpy Bar because walking and pushing our bikes up to the Wimpy Bar, we used to pass the head office and accounts department of the Co-op. And outside there was always stood a BSA Bantam, a red BSA Bantam with a red Michelin fairing on it. I used to admire it every Saturday morning. So just bear that thought in mind, because when it came up to the time for me to get a motorcycle, it was a given. I couldn't wait for 16 to come. It was a given that I was going to get a motorcycle. But when it came up to just before, we looked in the newspaper for a couple of weeks beforehand. I'd done my paper round. I worked in the shop at the corner and amassed my money together with my birthday money. I wanted a BSA C15, which was a 250 overhead valve single cylinder motorcycles. My dad thought that was a bit big to start on, and he was keen I got either a James or a Francis Barnett or a Bantam. Anyway, weekend before my birthday, lo and behold, a Bantam came up for sale in Marston, which was the other side of Oxford from where we lived. So I remember it. We went on the bus. Dad and I went on the bus, and we went to see this Bantam, and lo and behold, it was that very same Bantam that I passed every Saturday morning walking in through Oxford. And the guy, Mr. Roberts was his name, and he'd retired and he didn't need the bike anymore to commute backwards and forwards to work. And not only did we come away with a Bantam for £55, but he gave me his Ironhide riding coat. You know, I was about 8 stone 6 wet, and he was 6'3". And he put this jacket on me, and I had to literally be lifted. You know, Dad turned his cap backwards, which really impressed me, and rode it home. And he hadn't ridden the bike for years, motorbike for years. And I sat on the back in this enormous coat, a big pair of gauntlet gloves, and his crash helmet, his jet crash helmet. I have to say, I never wore the coat again, all the gloves, but I did use the crash helmet for a while until I could get a better crash helmet. But then the next thing that had to happen is that Dad, on my birthday, then he took me to a quiet lane, rode me to a quiet lane, taught me to ride the Bantam. Once I was confident going round in circles, I rode him home. And then, of course, you were off on your own. But I wasn't quite off on my own, because Dad was insistent that I took a training course. And every Sunday morning, the RAC ACU training scheme used to operate at the Presteel car park in Oxford, the car factories, and that was run by the Oxford Ixion Motorcycle Club. And so you went along, it was a 6-week course. I can't remember what it cost, but it cost next to nothing. And you met real motorcycle enthusiasts that help you. You took a test at the end of this. It wasn't the Ministry of Transport test, but you took a test and you were incredibly proficient. So passing the test was no problem. And I passed my test, but I'd enjoyed going along there so much that I decided that I would go back and help out. And that led me to go on to become an instructor and an examiner with the RAC ACU, and have a wonderful time teaching others, and met a lot of lifelong friends that you know, as I say, I'm still in touch with today, that where we all went through the training together. Now, obviously, you couldn't do that with a Bantam because it wasn't a big enough motorcycle. So I had to get a bigger motorcycle. And guys, I have to tell you, although I've said I'm very passionate about Nortons, but I have to tell you that there was one other motorcycle that I was far more passionate about than Bantams. And that came about because when I first learnt to ride, of course, we all take our bikes to school if we were old enough in the last year. And one of the guys there had passed his test early, and he came in one morning in a bike that really, really impressed me. It had a fishtail silencer. It was single cylinder. It was black and gold. Are you anybody ahead of me? Fishtail shaped silencer, black and gold tank, winner of 8 TTs post-war, pre-war. Velocet, thank you very much. Fantastic, brilliant. It was a Velocet, absolutely a Velocet. And that's what I wanted. I wanted a Velocet, and nothing else would do. So I said to Dad, I want to try, I want to change up. I want to get a Velocet. He said, leave it to me. I'll have an ask around. And within a week or so, he said, no, I found your Velocet. It belongs to one of the mechanics in the garage that I deal with. It needs to be repairing. So he's going to repair it for you. If you can wait 3 or 4 weeks, he'll repair it for you and you can have the bike. There was a photograph of it that he sent me, and I said, that's the bike for me. Now, couldn't wait to get it. Unfortunately, tragedy struck before I could get the motorcycle. They lived near to Blenheim Palace, and apparently there's a big lake in Blenheim Palace, and apparently he was working on my Velocet one afternoon on a Saturday. The dog had a lovely dog. The dog wanted to go for a walk, so he took the dog off for a walk across the grounds of Blenheim Palace. The dog came back wet. Sadly, Steve, his name was. Sadly, Steve never came back. And they don't know whether they found him in the lake. He couldn't swim. They don't know whether he fell in the lake or whether the dog went in the lake and he thought the dog had got into difficulties. Anyway, he sadly drowned in the lake. I was incredibly upset, of course, as my dad was, because he knew him quite well, for 2 reasons. Because I thought I would never get my Velocet. But I did get my Velocette because his father and the brother, because he'd made a promise for the bike, finished it for me. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Steve. Please, Mark. And there we go, guys. That's
an
in
MSS.
Viper 350 Viper Sport. If it was an MSS, that was Jeff. I recognise your voice, Jeff. If it was an MSS, it wouldn't have
Oxford number.
Yeah, FFC. It wouldn't have chrome guards. The MSS had black guards, and it also had half-width hubs. You could always tell a Viper or a Venom because you've got full-width hubs front and rear, and you've got chromium mud guards. That's the only, and you can tell them apart in other ways. Obviously, the engine number. If it's an MSS, it will be MSS. If it's a Venom, it's VM. It's a Viper, it's VR. And lots of people now use Viper crankcases because it's the same crankcases, but they put Venom top halves on. So there's an awful lot of Vipers that have been turned into Venoms. Anyway, that was the Viper. I couldn't wait to get it. It was my only transport for a few years. That picture was taken on a vintage run in the 80s. When I got a car, I got my first car, and then I got a company car. I think Dad's thought I was going to sell it. I said I would never sell it. And guys, I never have sold it. I still own it to this day. Blimey, how many years after I bought it? I bought it when I was just before I was 17, and I won't part with it. And it will go on to my sons as well. Last time I used it on the road was when I taught my sons to ride, because it's a perfectly great bike. It's tractable enough to go slow enough, and yet it's quick enough to do, to take on the Isle of Man and do a parade lap on. The Viper wasn't much slower, although it was a 350, it wasn't much slower than the 500, and they're absolutely beautiful handling motorcycles. So that's my Viper. Now, about a year after getting the Viper, I got into, motorcycle clubs, and I used to attend motorcycle clubs. And I used to attend a club just outside of Oxford in a small village called Cumnor. Those of you that are local will know where that is. And one evening we had somebody come along to talk to us, and his name was Dave Locke, and he was 50cc racing. He was UK's 50cc racing champion, and he rode a Honda single cylinder, and he brought it along, double overhead cam 50cc Honda, tiny little bike. He was a slight guy anyway, and he actually ran this thing, started it up on a megaphone silencer about 7 o'clock one evening in Cumnor village, till somebody came out and complained about the noise. To us, of course, it was music, but to someone else it was a racket. Anyway, Dave said how brilliant it was. He started racing a couple of years before, and he raced with a local club that had been started in 1967 called the Southern 67 Racing Club, and they were desperate for marshals. So was anybody in the club interested in going along to help out a marshal at Brands Hatch? Of course, I thought, that's for me. So I went off, a group of us, 3 or 4 of us went off and rode up to Brands Hatch. I remember marshalling at Clearways, being absolutely blown away by watching the racing. I went on a regular basis, got involved in the marshalling. And then, of course, when I got involved in the marshalling and I was doing a lot more traveling, I needed a bigger and faster motorcycle, because there was an opening for a traveling marshal. And you can't be a traveling marshal on a 350 Velocette. It's a lovely road bike, but it's not quick enough. So another motorcycle had to come along. So I said to Dad, I'm looking to, I want to upgrade the bike. Do you know if anybody's got anything for sale? I'd like at least a 500, possibly a 650. And then, of course, Dad got his way, because, as I told you, he was very passionate about Nortons. So guess what happens next? Mark, next slide, please. Okay, guys, who's gonna recognise it in its clubman's trim, track racing, travelling marshal trim, rear sets, Dunstall silencers, sweatbacks?
Is it a 650 SS?
It is indeed, Jeff again, 650 SS, absolutely, yeah, 650 SS. I had to keep the carrier on it, because I'll explain about why it needed the carrier on in a minute, because it wasn't just used. It wasn't used for everyday transport anymore, but it was my track bike and also my long distance road bike. These days, those they were adjustable ace bars, Tomaselli levers, Tomaselli twist grip. I wouldn't. Yeah, well done, Ewan. Yes, yeah. Now you're talking. I wouldn't ride very far on a bike like that with my back and shoulders now. However, in those days, you know, we didn't care. But I also put bigger pistons in it, lumpier pistons. You have ridden that one, Wayne, but not in that trim. You're quite right. You rode it on the Isle of Man. John took it. My son John took it to the Isle of Man, if you remember, when you got your Honda 4, and he rode it over there. Yes, I put high compression pistons in it. Changed the 1.5 monoblocks. You've got 2 monoblock carburetors, but there was only 1 float chamber. So I changed those over for 32 mil concentrics to give it to more breathing. It was a quick bike. John Hudson, who was the Norton guru, worked for the Norton factory, was a tuner for Nortons. He actually adjusted everything up for me one day at a Norton Owners Club meeting, and the bike went extremely well. And that was a lovely, I put a Commando twin leading shoe front brake in it to improve the stopping performance of it. I put TT100 tires on it, and it was a very, very nice track bike. Now, I said I'd come back to the Carrier. Okay, now that Carrier's on there for a specific reason. So Dunstall silencers, yeah, absolutely. Dunstall decibel silencers, they're still in the loft somewhere. I've still got them. They've got little pipes in the end of them as they were really racing megaphones, but they put welded little pipes in the end just to give them a bit of diffusion with the sound. But it was a very, very quick pleasant. Of course, featherbed frame, and that came about for those of you that doesn't know where that came from. Post-war, Norton changed from their garden gate frame to their featherbed frame, and it was called a featherbed frame because one of the racers said this bike handles like it's so comfortable, it's like a featherbed, and that's where the featherbed frame came from. Anyway, back to why it's got a Carrier. Right now, well, I met my wife in 1971, and she didn't know I was interested in motorcycles. I'd taken her out a few times. I got a company car, an HB Viva, I think, an HB Viva estate. I'd taken her out a couple of times, and she was a nurse, and so she didn't get many weekends off. Anyway, she announced one evening I'd taken her out that she was off on Sunday. Of course, that was a little bit difficult because I'd agreed to go to the Thruxton 500 miler with my mates on Sunday on the Norton. So I said to her, look, I'm really sorry. I said, love to take you out. I said, but I'm committed to go to a motorcycle race meeting. So just off the cuff, I said, I suppose you wouldn't like to come. Oh, yeah, she said, my dad used to have a scooter. I used to ride on the back of it. I'll come along. So I lent her my, one of my old riding jackets and an old helmet. So off she came on the back of the bike. Fortunately, it rained. She didn't complain. She was the world's best pillion passenger. And fortunately, she wanted to go out on the bike again. But the Carrier was the only concession that I had to make because she had to have somewhere to put her handbag. So that's why the Carrier's on the back of the bike there. Now, another story about that is that I used to do a lot of marshalling, not just with the Sun 67, but with other racing clubs. And of course, I took Lynn with me eventually to do some marshalling. Again, she was in the borrowed Bellstaff kit. So we were stood in the queue to sign on. And of course, I knew the guy who was signing on. Oh, Terry, he said. So he glances up at Lynn, who stood behind me in this shapeless, 3 sizes too big Bellstaff jacket with her helmet still on. And he said, is he with you? That cost me a set of leathers, guys. After that. But I'm delighted to say that Lynn's been riding on the back of me now for over 45 years, and she's still the world's best pillion passenger. So that's great. Can you move on to the next slide, please, Mark? Thank you very much. Okay. Does anybody recognise these motorcycles at all? Anybody help me with these?
They look like grass crackers.
No. Well done, Wayne. BRS, thank you. Brooklands Road Specials. So what you have there are 3 Nortons, post First World War Nortons. The one on the left-hand end of the picture, number 39, is a Model 9 TT. The one in the centre, that the old boy with the cap, who's called Bill Fruin, who's an ex-Norton Works mechanic, is bent down adjusting, is a BS, a Brooklyn Special, number 40, and number 41 is a BRS, a Brooklands Road Special. Now, these motorcycles are very, very special. I got interested in vintage bikes probably around 73. I met Lynn. I'd already met Lynn. She used to help me clean wheels, would you believe it? She doesn't now. And my first vintage bike came out of Exchange and Mart, and it was an XWD 500 side valve 16H Norton. And it came from Stratford-on-Avon. So I lived in Oxford, and I went up and bought it one evening, restored it. Anyway, in buying the bits to restore it, I met this old guy, Bill Fruin, who had a motorcycle dealership at Benson. Is that an HP Beaver at the back?
Yeah.
Oh, blimey!
Yeah,
It's a Rover 2000 that I can see in the picture. Right now,
it's an HB
Bill,
Beaver and an A55 pickup.
Oh, right, that was Bill's pickup, and you had to have a lesson of how to rope the bikes in. You see, I got to know Bill quite. He was a funny old stick. In fact, he was such a funny old stick that if you came into the shop for a spare part and he didn't like you, he wouldn't sell it to you. Anyway, I got on really well with him. And every year, these three bikes, he used to ride the BS, but he used to let other people that he liked ride the Model 9 TT and the BRS. Unfortunately, for 2 years, he let me ride the BRS number 41. And what these stand for is that after the First World War, the Brooklands track, of course, once the war was over, there was a lot of hangars there not being used. And a guy called Donovan, who was Irish, an Irish tuner, with Rex Judd, who was a famous racer of that period, was his rider and tester. O'Donovan used to tune Norton's engines for Norton. They'd send in 5 side valve engines each week on a lorry and a carrier. Him and Judd would tune them up, stick them in a slave frame, run them in, and then run them round Brooklands. And if they do 70 miles an hour over a timed length, they would be stamped BRS. And if they do 75, they'd be stamped BS, Brooklyn Special. So you bought these bikes with a certificate to say they'd been round Brooklands at those speeds, and they were used for racing. 500cc side valve, very light, direct belt drive. So you've got effectively no clutch. You've got a hand throttle, a foot brake, a front brake, which is just like a stirrup brake of a bicycle that rubs on the rim. So effectively no brakes. And the brake on the back was like a wedge that you pushed in the belt rim. So it sort of jammed the belt rim up, okay, to stop it. But they were very, very quick and very light. And you have to push them off at every set of traffic lights and every road junction. Now, when Bill passed away a few years later, and all the bikes went to auction. Sadly, at that time, I was unable to purchase one of the bikes. I wanted to buy my bike, number 41, but I was unable to afford it. Anyway, I kept track of it. And it was eventually ended up being swapped for something else to a friend of mine who lives up in Hertfordshire. And he said to me, we were at an event, and he said, I've got that BRS come into my possession. So I said, look, Mick, if ever you sell that BRS, please, my name's on it. So he said, no, I promise you, Terry, if ever that comes up for sale, it's yours. Next slide, please, Mark. And there we go. CT4419, the very same BRS, with me riding it on a Banbury run. And you can probably see a bit more details. You can see there that it's got the belt rim brakes on the front. It's an incredibly nice motorcycle to ride. It's incredibly tractable to ride. It's very fast. I mean, I wouldn't attempt to do 70 miles an hour on it these days, but it'll sing along at 50 and keep up with normal traffic. And it's so easy to start. You might think that it's a job to push off. It isn't. Literally, you just paddle it away, you drop the valve lifter, and off it goes. Pomp, 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 and away you go. It's an amazing motorcycle, just an amazing motorcycle to ride. Okay. Next slide, please, Mark. Right. This is not the same Norton, guys. It's a similar run. It's another Banbury run, but it's at Toaster Racecourse. This one in the car park at Toaster Racecourse. Now, what I hope the BSA is in there. Oh yes, okay, probably. All right, I see what you're coming from. Okay, right. Does anybody recognise this Norton, and can anybody tell me an approximate year of it, please?
1920s, anyway.
It's definitely 20s. Yeah, definitely 20s. Okay, well, I'm going to give you a couple more questions now, guys, just before I come on to this one. Which British motorcycle manufacturer has won more TTs than anyone else? Which British motorcycle manufacturer has won more TTs than anyone else?
I would say Norton.
And put it in the chat, Jeff. Put it in the chat.
Sorry. I'll shut up.
Yeah, yeah. And here's one for the car buffs. Where did the name Mercedes-Benz come from? Where did the name Mercedes-Benz come from? Okay, guys, yes, you can see it's on the tank. It's a Norton, but this isn't a side valve Norton. This is an overhead valve Norton. What happened is Norton raced their side valves very successfully. Lots of manufacturers did until the early 20s. And then companies like AJS produced overhead valve engines, put the valves upstairs, as they called it. So it wasn't the daughter of Mr. Benz, but you're close. Okay, put the valves upstairs. So Norton got behind. Their side valves were not competitive, so they decided that they would produce their own overhead valve engine. This is the first version of the Norton overhead valve engine. It's called a Model 18, and Norton didn't produce it for the road. Daimler's daughter, quite correct. Norton didn't produce it. Carl Benz, it comes from Carl Benz, who was one of the first manufacturers, and Daimler's daughter was called Mercedes. You're quite right. That's where it comes from. So Norton decided to build this overhead valve engine, called it the Model 18, and they won absolutely everything in 1924. They called it the year of firsts. They won the TT, they won the European Championship. So they decided that they would then produce a Model 18 for the road. And very luckily, it passed through my hands a few years ago. I managed to pick up a 1925 version. They got heavier, they got bigger tanks, they got bigger brakes, but they were never as quick as these early ones. That's a very quick motorcycle. That motorcycle will do 80 miles an hour, which for a 1925 motorcycle is incredible. Don't be fooled by the very small front brake. Lots of vintage motorcycles had small front brakes, but the Norton has a big 8-inch brake on the back, because in the vintage era, often it was thought that they put 2 brakes on the back wheel. They thought that it was dangerous to have a big brake on the front wheel, so you would do your braking at the back. Never mind the fact that you skid more, of course, if you're braking on the back wheel, but that's the way they did it. But the brake on the front's quite effective, because it's what you have to remember with all these vintage motorcycles is they're extremely light motorcycles. So they're quite light and nimble to ride. So that's a much younger version of me riding that lovely Model 18. Right. Okay. Do you want to go on to the next slide, please, Mark? Right. Looks like a period motorcycle, doesn't it? Looks like a period photograph. In fact, it isn't. It was taken. That's Lynn and the 2 boys when they were quite young, and we used to turn out like this for vintage events. And that gentleman is well. Can anybody tell me? Anybody give me an approximate year and size of the engine of that particular motorcycle, please? Anything coming up in the chat? Brilliant picture of what? Okay, right. It's a 1927 1000cc V-twin VSA, and it comes with a number 10A sidecar, and that number 10A sidecar is the only one that I know in existence, and it's a 3-seater sidecar, and where the adult sits closer to the motorcycle, and the two children sit in tandem, so one sits behind the other, and that came from a few doors away from where I used to live in Oxfordshire. And it was a guy had a small collection of sort of artifacts in sort of a farm museum, and he had this motorcycle. And when he retired from his farm museum and moved to Cornwall, he came around my house and he said, "Would you like to buy my BSA?" And I said, "Yes, I would love to." And when I went to pick it up, he gave me a spare engine with it as well. And it'd been in a dry barn for about 20 years. And honestly, guys, I cleaned out the tank, I blew up the tires, I changed the plugs, and it went second kick. So it was an incredible motorcycle. And specifically mention this because it has a connection with Roundtable and with ourselves. Because in 1990, when I was area chairman of Area 50, together with Tony Cross, who was area chairman of Area 25, at a national conference, I said to Tony, when we'd had quite a lot to drink, because we were sharing a hotel with the two areas, that I'd always wanted to ride from John O'Groats to Land's End. He was a police motorcyclist with the City of London Police, and he said, I'll help you do that. So the plan was hatched that we would do a joggle. Barry's done it on a bicycle. Tony Cross and I would do it on that. I had a support team. Mike Fitchett's on here, Martin Green's on here, part of my support team. And when I was area chairman, I rode this from the 1st to the 8th of July in early, easy stages from John O'Groats to Land's End for charity as area chairman. We called it the Roundtable Vintage Challenge. We took it to national conference. We pushed it to a fanfare. And this is a family show, so I couldn't show the picture, unfortunately. But we had a young lady sat in the sidecar who went and presented Gareth George with one of their sweatshirts after we made our presentation. Unfortunately, of course, we didn't have to take it. We didn't have a spare one, so she had to take hers off and give it to Gareth. And that went down extremely well, of course, at national conference. But it was a brilliant event to do. It rained every day. When we drove down the country, we had a fantastic time. The 9 of us in the team that did it. And unbelievably, 2 weeks after I came back, it gave no trouble. I didn't need a spare engine. I broke a valve spring coming over Shap, but I got a spare side valve. You just easy to change it. Take out the cotter, put another valve in. And 2 weeks after I'd done the Vintage Challenge, I'd taken the boys to a steam fair in it. I was pushing it in the garage. There was a bit of a bang, and the sidecar wheel fell off. The spindle for the sidecar wheel had worn right through. There must have been a crack in it, and I must have come all the down the country hanging on to about 1/4 of an inch of metal. Obviously, I got a new spindle made, and that was absolutely fine. Next slide, please, Mark. And Nigel Morgan, I've seen you're on this call this evening, and that's from the Oxford Mail with Nigel, who was the chairman of Oxford 144 at the time, which is my own table, presenting me with a cheque from Table towards the charity for the ride down the country. So there's a shot of me with the BSA with a rondel, as you can see on the front of the sidecar. And if you'd like to put the next slide on, please, Mark. Right. Again, you'll see this is March the 18th, 1988. There I am on the left of your picture on Motorcycles of Yesteryear. And this gentleman is one of them in the past, one of the oldest motorcycles that I've ever owned. Can anybody possibly give me any idea of what the date might be on that motorcycle? 1904. Any good? Somebody said 1904. Any advance? 1902. Well done, Don. You absolutely got it. It's 1902. Anybody? You probably won't see the name on the tank. Can anybody come up with the name on the tank, please? I've suddenly picked up a lot of background. Somebody got their microphone open. Quadrant. You're absolutely right. It's a 1902 Quadrant, guys. And it's 232 cc, and Quadrant were the first ever wholly British motorcycles. There were bikes before that, Ariel, Excelsior, but they used either Belgian or French engines. Quadrant were the first people to make their own frame and engines, and they were made at Sheep Street in Birmingham. And the Quadrant make was very famous, but only up to and just after the First World War. They made staid and steadied motorcycles that were used by doctors and traveling salespeople. They were never anything exciting. They did well at long distance trials, but they never did very well in racing. However, that model of motorcycle, not my particular one, I don't claim that to be the case at all, but that actual model of that year, exactly like that motorcycle, was the first ever motorcycle to set a record for riding from John O'Groats to Land's End. And it was done by a guy called Tom Silver, who was a gentleman rider and a director of the Quadrant Motorcycle Company. He fought in the Boer War, and he wanted a job after the Boer War, and he bought himself into Quadrant, and he used to ride, you know, in trials and competitively with a motorcycle. Anybody like to hazard a guess how long it took him in 1902 to ride that motorcycle from John O'Groats to Land's End? 6 days. Thank you. 4 days. Remember, he did it in the middle of the summer, and he rode in every hour of daylight that he could ride in. And he also had to stop and buy accumulators, and it runs on special fuel. So it was quite a feat to do that. So look, carbide lights, you're quite right. Yep. 2 days, right? Okay. 7 days. He did it in just over 37 hours, guys, by almost non-stop riding. Incredible. And that bike came again from a village in Oxfordshire I lived in, and it was found in the top of a barn, in that original condition, just like that. So, and that was a beautiful, very difficult to ride. Again, no clutch, run on special fuel, no oil pump. You have to open a little valve, pump the oil. You're supposed to get off and do it every 7 miles, but I managed to perfect it doing while I was riding along. There's no inlet valve. It has a valve that opens and closes with the suction of the piston and pulls the mixture down. And when it fires, it then has a side exhaust valve. Very interesting motorcycle to ride. It was so tall that I had to lower the saddle. I mean, I'm not short, but it was like riding a 5-bar gate. It was so high, but an incredible motorcycle to ride. Now, just before I move on to the next slide, I'd like to cover a little bit about racing, because as I said to you earlier, I got involved in marshalling, but the next stage from marshalling and being a traveling marshal was, what about if I wanted to do some racing? How are we doing on time, guys? How are we doing on time? Am I all right for time? Nobody's telling me, so I'll carry on. Okay. I wanted to get involved in racing. I didn't want to ride the Norton. What I wanted to do was race a Velocet, and Velocet produced a very fast motorcycle. It's called a Velocet Thruxton. It came out in 1965, and it was called the Thruxton because it won the Thruxton 500 miler. It also won the Clubman TT, and it produced almost 50 brake horsepower, which is about the same as a Manx Norton out the back wheel. They were very expensive. I couldn't possibly afford one. I remember riding up, looking in King's window when they came out, you know, face pressed to the glass. Who you call? Face pressed to the glass, but I couldn't afford one. Anyway, I thought, well, I'll actually see if I can find one. So I found one in Exchange and Mart in Greenwich in London, other side of London. I phoned the guy up. He wanted £195 for it. This is in 1970 something. Wanted £195 for it. So I got my mate Graham to take. We set off after work on a Thursday evening from Oxford after work to ride to Greenwich on the back of his Commando. He had a 750 Commando. So we rode to Greenwich, bought the motorcycle, and then rode it back. The first thing that happened is that the lights failed after I'd gone not very far. The next thing that happened was that I looked back and the whole back end of the machine was covered in oil. Anyway, we had to press on. So I vividly remember, this is pre-motorway days, riding down the A40, that's a dual carriageway from London to Oxford, about 11 o'clock at night, with Graham doing 80 with his headlight on and me riding behind him on side lights that were failing as well. My dad went spare when I got home. Anyway, I soon sorted it out. And joined the motorcycle club and went racing, and that's where I learned about racing. I learned that I would never make a road racer, and I have an amazing regard for those people that can ride motorcycles that fast. I have amazing regard for them because I would never take the risks that those guys take. And you have to remember that they absolutely do it because they love it. I would enjoy riding round. I'd enjoy the cut and thrust of it. But if I came into a corner, you know, and the pack closed up and there was no gap, I'd hang back and then try and overtake on the straight. You're never going to win races like that. Your Barry Sheens and your Rosses, even if there's not a gap, they just go through. They just take you out of the way. And I've been to the Isle of Man many, many times, and I've watched road racing. I've been involved in marshalling on the Isle of Man. I'll come to that in a minute. For many years, and I've learned to respect road racers, but I've also learned never to feel sorry for them if they die. And there's an awful lot of fatalities at the Isle of Man. Never feel sorry for them if they die, because they only exist in our world. They only live when they've got that throttle pegged right to the stop. That's what they live for. They'll sell their grandmother, they'll mortgage their house, they'll do anything at all to get on that bike and absolutely go for it. So they exist in our world. So they know all the risks, but you would never stop them doing it. So guys, obviously feel more sorry for their families than them, because you will never stop them. You'll never stop them racing. That's their passion of life. Okay, would you like to move on to the next slide, please, Mark? Okay, anybody recognize that? BSA, thank you. Well done, Jeff. It's a BSA three-wheeler. It's a W3410. Okay. Now, here's a quick question for you now. BSA three-wheelers were different from Morgans. In what way, guys? Why were they different from Morgans? What's different about a BSA three-wheeler than a Morgan three-wheeler? It's a really interesting, it's called a cycle car. Front-wheel drive. Who said front-wheel drive? Okay. It's not a two-stroke. Okay. It's not, yes, Morgan's had four-cylinder engines as well as V-twin engines. BSA had V-twin engines as well as four-cylinder engines. Morgan put their engines, their V-twin engines on the front of the bonnet. BSA put them inside the bonnet. So that BSA, you wouldn't know whether it was a four-cylinder or whether it was a V-twin. But it is a four-cylinder, but it's front-wheel drive. That's the difference. So the engine is back to front. So it's a front-wheel drive vehicle with a changeover box, and it's got a limited slip differential, and it runs belt brakes. And by not expanded hubs, you've got like a ring with like a clamped on the outside of the ring, not inside like an internal expanding brake. It's like a piece of material that clamps around it. So they're not very effective brakes, and your best brake is your back wheel brake again. Now, the other thing about this, my wife used to drive it, Lynn. The other thing about it is that, like quite a lot of vintage cars, the pedals are in a completely different position to a normal car. So your accelerator's in the same position. So that's underneath your right leg. No, sorry. I'm getting that. No, I'm absolutely right. Accelerator there. But the brake is in the middle. The clutch is in the middle, and the brake is on the right hand side. So your clutch is in the middle, and your brake is on your left hand side. So you've got to be really careful when you're driving it, because if you get it wrong and you go to put your foot on the clutch where the clutch normally is, you put your foot on the brake. Fortunately, as I say, the brakes are not as efficient. But it was a lovely car to drive, same as the Elvis, same as a lot of vintage cars from that era. But it was a lovely motor car, and I thoroughly enjoyed owning it. Okay, right. Back to the Isle of Man, guys. Next slide, please, Mark. Great. That's taken on the Isle of Man. That's me riding not the 350 Velocette, not the 500 Thruxton, but a 1939 350 KSS, which is a 350 overhead cam Velocette. Another bike that passed through my hands over the years, and that picture would have been taken again in the 80s. I always wanted to go to the Isle of Man, never got round to it as a youngster, but in 1976, the year after we got married, my dad had to take early retirement from work. He was 62 through ill health, and we thought we were going to lose him. And he'd always wanted to. He lived to be 93, by the way, in the end. He'd always wanted to go to the Isle of Man, so Lynn and I took him and Mum to the Isle of Man for an experience. And we absolutely loved it. So we went back the following year. I bought an MZ250 because I needed a bike with indicators to help with the training course. So we rode over that for the first time on that. And then we liked it so much, we decided that that was in 77, that we'd go back in 78 for the 78 TT only because Mike Hailwood was making his comeback. We'd signed on to be marshals in 77, and we marshaled again on the island at Laurel Bank this time in 78. And I can't tell you how impressive it was to see Mike Hailwood. I remember watching him in the 60s, but how impressive it was to watch him actually racing again in the 70s. And of course he won. He won that race absolutely straight out on the Ducati. And you could have put a matchstick in the road at Laurel Bank and he'd have ridden over it every time. And the celebration on the island that night when he won that event was amazing. There were 35,000 people on the island that year watching Mike Hailwood. I've only done 2 TTs. That's 78 and 2013. The rest have all been Manx Grand Prix or Classic TTs. And last year would have been my 41st visit. So you can say I've done quite a few things on the Isle of Man, but more than going to watch the racing, I've ridden in the vintage events. And in 2004, the team that organised the vintage events that I'd ridden in for 22 years decided that he'd had enough and he needed to retire, and no one would take them over. So my eldest son that's been coming with, well, both my boys have been coming with me, but my Ghastly beer, no, wonderful beer. Oakles, fantastic, best brewery in the world. Oakles bitter. My eldest son, who's been coming with me to the island every year for years, said, "Come on, Dad, you could do that. I'll help you. Mum will help." So I phoned Lynn. She said, "All right, then we'll do it." So we took it on together with Wayne Fort and Colin Turton, who are on this, both 41ers from Clevedon. I roped in and a whole load of other friends. And we ran the event between 2004 and 2009. And we had a wonderful time. We ran it for 5 years. We had a wonderful time. We took it on to its next stage. And in the end, we ran an 8-day event, including a lap of the TT in 3 parts, TT course in 3 parts on closed roads. That's on closed roads, that picture's taken. So people would actually experience riding on closed roads. And we did time trials around the TT circuit, a dinner, packed lunches, and you got all that for £58. You had to get yourself there and you had to find your own accommodation, but we did all that for people for £58. And I still ride in the event, now. And it's an absolutely amazing island. And if any of you, Nigel, if anybody's not been, guys, please jump at the chance. I promise you, you will love the Isle of Man. I mean, it didn't happen this last year, sadly, so I didn't get my 41st year. But I'm hoping that it's the gooseneck. It is the gooseneck, Robert. Absolutely, it's at the gooseneck. Which you can see Ramsey in the distance, the coast of Ramsey in the distance. Yeah, that's taken at the gooseneck. So you're absolutely right. Right now, I'm going to be running. Well, I've actually probably run out of time. They've only got a few more slides, so let's whistle through those then. Now, Mark, next one up, please. Right, that's another sidecar outfit. That's Lynn and I at the Banbury Run. That's a 500 BSA 1924 with a Watsonian single-seater sidecar. That's again another bike that's passed through my hands and was a lovely motorcycle. Next one up, please, Mark. This is the bike I've paraded on the Isle of Man many times. For those, anybody tell me what it is? It's a coffee factory. General Foods behind. International, well done. Yeah, well done, guys. Whoever put International, it's a 500 Norton International. It's a Bitzer, guys. I bought it as a Bitzer and turned it into that. It's a 1932 490cc bronze scold inter-engine with a TT carburetor in a Manx featherbed frame with a Manx Electron front hub. It's got a Dominate, well, it's got a Triumph hub in the back actually, but it looks like a Manx hub. But I don't care. It's a most beautiful motorcycle to ride. It's got a close ratio Manx box in it. So it's bump and go. I love riding it. My son loves riding it. On the Isle of Man, we take the baffle out of the Mega and we use it without a baffle in it, and we absolutely love it. And I've paraded that bike many times around the Isle of Man and also at Derby. You'll notice that I've cheated slightly these days, because if you look at the handlebars, they look like clip-ons, but they're swan neck clip-ons. So TT100s, yes, Jeff, they're swan neck clip-ons. So you get a bit of a racing crouch, but it doesn't do your back and neck in. Now, do I also run modern motorcycles? Well, I don't run anything modern, this is the next motorcycle is the youngest motorcycle I have. Mark, next screen. Next slide, please. Anybody recognize that? I know it says Ducati, but does anybody recognize the model? Oh, it's got it on the back. It's a Superlight. Yeah. No, it's not an 888. It's a 900 Superlight, limited edition Superlight, and I absolutely love it. If only I get to ride it, because both of my boys like it as well. So I hardly get a chance to ride it. Both my sons ride, fortunately. They've got their own motorcycles, but sometimes they, Terry, is it a craft centre? Sorry, I didn't pick that up. The boys like riding the bikes as well. Okay, move on to the next one, please, Mark. Right, that's a 1919 Triumph Model H. That's again on the Banbury Run. That's a motorcycle that I do loan out to other people to ride. My sons have ridden it. I've let other friends ride it. I've owned it since 1976, and it's a belt. Bloody awful. Yes, Wayne's ridden it, as you can see. It's belt drive, 550cc, but I think it's just a lovely motorcycle. Again, it's got virtually no brakes, but it's incredible fun to ride. Okay, and next slide, please, Mark. That's a shot of the car rally. That's the third car rally, and I'd like to thank Ray Hill for coming up with the idea of the car rally. That's Wayne's Morris Minor. He's put on the right there, the convertible. That we ran that at Yeovil, again with the help of Wayne and Colin, and we had 40 cars there for the weekend. Guys, if you've not done a car rally, 41 Club car rally, please do it. It's the 18th to the 20th if it happens in June. It's run by John Alford in Kent. And I know he's hoping we usually get 40, if not more cars. Please come to it. You don't have to have a classic car, a cherished car will do. Okay, it's absolutely amazing event to do. Next slide, please, Mark. That's past president now, but national president at the time, Andrew. And Nigel Morgan. Nigel, that's you. I thought you'd be on this call on your Yamaha, being flagged off from Hinkley Island Hotel, where we held the first ever motorcycle rally. And there's another one of those hopefully coming up this year in Norfolk. Didn't happen last year, 9th to the 11th of July. And that's run by Tim and Kelly, who are on the call tonight. Okay, next slide, please, Mark. As I mentioned to you early on, I did start moving into cars in the 90s. I started off by restoring a 1972 MG Midget, again, the connection with Oxford. But I always wanted something older, and TC, yes, Jeff, absolutely. And again, that came from Oxford. Another contact in Oxford through the MG Car Club, another motorcyclist said to me, Terry, I know you want a TC. I know where there is one. And I bought that in 1999. It was rebuilt in Canada on an ash frame in around 94, re-imported to the UK. All TCs were right-hand drive. Only TDs were made in left-hand drive. So, so if you re-import a car, it's going to be right-hand drive. It's done the car rally many times. It's the most amazing car to drive. Again, one of those things that I love and would never part with. And finally, guys, and I've got let's give you another quiz question. BSA also made a four-wheel car in the 1930s. What was it called, guys? What was it called? The BSA car of the 1930s, four-wheel car. Let's give you another question. And there were two sets of initials that were famous in pre-Second World War motorcycle racing, and they both have an A in them. What are the two sets of initials? They're on the tanks of motorcycles, and they both have an A in. AJS, thank you. What does AJS stand for, Alan? What does AJS stand for? What's the other one? No, not so the AJS is correct. I mentioned it earlier on. My dad. Yes, it does. Alfred John Stevens is AJS. JAP, yes, JAP. JAP's the other one. What does JAP stand for?
John Arthur Prestwich.
Correct. Absolutely. Fantastic. Brilliant. And okay, this is the very last question, guys, that I'm going to ask you. And then I'm just going to talk about the Bentley. The first TT race on the Isle of Man was held in 1907. There were two classes. Not everybody knows that. for single cylinders and twin cylinder motorcycles. Who were the winners? I want the machine and the rider, please. Who won both classes and who rode the motorcycles? Right. Last slide. I've always wanted a Bentley. Always wanted a Bentley. For 40 years, I think I've wanted a Bentley. And when I was national president, I went to speak at Abingdon, sat next to a guy who I'd known for years, but hadn't really ever, knew as another tabler. And then in 41, I never really chatted to him. And we were talking away, and he said, "What's your hobbies?" And I said, "Classic cars and motorcycles." "What have you always wanted, a Bentley?" He said, "I've got a Bentley. It hasn't been used for 3.5 years. It doesn't go, but I want to get rid of it." And so guess what? I ended up with it. My son rebuilt it all for me, redid the engine for me. And that is my 1996 6.75 litre V8 Bentley Brooklands, which is a most beautiful motor car to drive. And gentlemen, there you have it. That is my life on two wheels and on wheels. I've absolutely enjoyed it. I hope I haven't bored you. I'm delighted to take some. That would okay, and that will be I hope you've enjoyed it, because I've certainly enjoyed presenting it to you. Let me give you some answers to those questions. Who holds the highest number of TT wins pre-war, pre-Second World War? Was Stanley Woods with 10 wins. Norton, you're quite right, with 94 wins. By the way, Honda have won the most TTs ever. They've got 255 wins. And does anybody know then the name of who won the first TTs, the first TT race in each class? Somebody come off mute and let me know.
No.
No, okay. Well, the twin cylinder.
Rem Fowler.
Correct. What was he riding?
Norton.
Brilliant. Absolutely. Who won the single cylinder class, and what was the motorcycle?
It was an AJS, but was it?
No, wasn't an AJS.
No.
No. It was a matchless.
Oh yeah.
And it was ridden by Charlie Collier, and the Collier brothers made matchlesses at the time. They bought AJS, so you weren't far away, but they didn't buy AJS until much later on. So there we go. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Terry. I'm just going to hand over to Peter again to start off the thanks for such an awesome talk.
Thanks very much, Terry. That's absolutely fantastic. Could listen to you all night. Your knowledge is absolutely unbelievable. But I'd like to hand over now to another expert on the bikes, Tim Gilbert, who will give a vote of thanks, please. Tim.
I couldn't find the mute button to unmute myself there. Good evening, everybody. Terry, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I was struggling with the quiz, I must admit. I did much better with the one that you set at the motorbike meeting in Hinckley. A couple of things that you talked about brought back some memories for me. You're talking about your family history. In 2014, when I got married to the current Mrs. Gilbert, don't tell her I said that. We spent our honeymoon on a bike tour in Europe, and she booked us into an Airbnb in Mandello dell'Ario, which is on Lake Como in Italy, and we were staying with the great nephew of one of the guys that started Moto Guzzi, and his workshop was still adjoined to the house. And needless to say, the great nephew, little workshop. And then you were talking about your BSA three-wheeler and the layout of the pedals, which reminded me of my Volvo 760 that I had a number of years ago, which was automatic. And I hadn't driven an automatic before. And unfortunately, I went for the clutch, which is non-existent, but I did manage to hit the brake pedal. Sudden unexpected stop, because when you go for a clutch pedal, you really go for it, don't you? So anyway, yeah, the biker meeting, hopefully, although I'm doubtful about it, 9th to the 11th of July in Kings Lynn. So any bikers out there who are interested in that, hope to see it. But with the current situation, I'm somewhat doubtful, but we'll live in hope. So yeah, great evening, Terry. Thank you very much. And hopefully we'll see you in the summer.
Yes, I'll be there if it's running.
Yep, good.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks very much. Right, guys, just before I hand over to Steve, as you know, about the conference being cancelled, we're all raring to go and meet each other at a big event again. My PLC have got a party of all parties on the back burner, which will be the 75th ball celebration, which, like Tim, it's planned for July, but we may have to move that again. So just look for the date. It will happen when the world's ready for it. Okay, I'll hand over to Steve now. We'll give you an update of the next events, please. You're on mute, Steve.
Here we are. Yeah, I knew it'd catch me out one day. I was going to say next week we've got a bit of a break because we are holding a Burns night on the 26th of January, a virtual Burns night. We've got a great team who've put the event together. As I say, a traditional Burns night, but virtual. If anyone wants to have the traditional supper, please go on to 41connects.co.uk site where you can order a meal. It will be plenty enough for 2 people. The following week, on the 4th of Feb, we have something special, a cricket match special with Jonathan Agnew and Jeff Miller. That will be a very interesting night for those cricket fans. And I'll just mention the 11th of Feb, because I could run off till March. We've got a special Valentine's cook-along. And for those of you who look about Chinese New Year, it is the start of Chinese New Year on that date. So the cook-along will be courtesy of Luban Kitchen. And we're teaming up for a great charity, Leukemia Care. So they're also promoting it. And Luban have kindly agreed to donate money for every box purchased towards Leukemia Care. So I hope you can enjoy and attend at least one, or ideally all of the events with us. And, you know, it has been a great night and a great attendance. So keep it up, please. And before I go, I've got to hand over to Roger.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Guys, thanks for joining tonight. Just take the opportunity, whilst we've got all the petrol heads together, as it were. There's a friend of mine coming on, Asa Pertiyabi, who is also a member with me in a club, a Finnish 41 club, and he's dying to tell you about their own motorcycle meeting, their bikers meeting, which is from Friday the 16th to Sunday the 18th of July of this year. It's based at Hotel Kuru Selka in Kuru in Finland. So you're motoring up from Tampere to Kuru. It's a 2 nights package from €250 per person. And there's guided driving from Tampere to Kuru, which is a 300-kilometre route. There's coffee and snacks en route, mini spa and dinner at the hotel. That's all on the Friday. And on the Saturday, there's breakfast at the hotel and guided driving for another 300 kilometres, visiting World UNESCO heritage sites and lakeside saunas and barbecues, etc. And on the Sunday, there's a farewell brunch and driving back home. So you can take your own bike over there, or you can fly over and hire motorcycles and cars locally. And it should be a great event, but I really encourage you to go if you can. It dovetails in nicely with our own meeting, car meeting, as you've heard. And I'll now hand over to Asa to tell you all about it. So, Asa, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. What can I say? You put it so nicely and with a fantastic Lancashire accent, not like mine. Those who don't know me, Esa Jalmari Pirttijärvi is my name, and I am a current member of the Ribbenlund Active Sporting 41 Club, along with a member of the Tampere International 957 Old Tablers Club as well. This motorcycle meeting is not held first time. It is the 16th year when it's been held, and it started. History of the event started on 2005 when 3 motorcycle petrol heads, as Roger said, went to South Africa, and they started the race from there. It took them quite a while to try back to Finland from South Africa, but they did get back for the next year on 2006 when they actually went to Austria. The following year in Germany, they also had a race into Italy and France as well. In the latter years, it has been organized in Finland, and what a fantastic place to visit indeed. And I don't work for the Finnish tourist board, but I just love my home native country. Obviously, taking the coronavirus situation into account, the bikes can be hired locally over there. Also, some of the motorcycle club members, they have second bikes as well, so we'll try to accommodate that. As Finland is known for sauna, swim, and salmiakki, President Peter, he loves this salmiakki drink. So, and now when you travel to Finland, you can bring back duty frees, which is fantastic. As UK is not in the EU anymore, and allocation is 4 liters of spirits. So that should be plenty to last anybody for a little while. It is a fantastic package, 2 nights, and it can be extended into a more longer period time, of course, as well. You can fly to Helsinki by Finnair or KLM and hire a bike from there, or come to Tampere, which is the second city of Finland, the biggest inland city of Scandinavia. Kelly Clark mentioned that he's very interested in going, as he had some visits from his Finnish friends in the past, but he's never been over there before. Along with being the 16th to 18th of July, when there's going to be plus 30 degrees centigrade, nearly 24-hour daylight, absolutely fantastic driving conditions. Better than now, as I checked today, it's minus 28 and plenty of snow. So it's better to do the motorcycle meeting during the summertime, of course. Anyhow, there is a flyer which is being produced. I don't know if Mark had it or not. He could put it on the screen. But I will hope to get it into the 41 Club Bikers Facebook page. And we have our own as well, so we'll update that if and when new information comes along. It'd be fantastic opportunity. You are guaranteed to have fantastic, friendly, hospitable, welcome and true fun and fellowship over there with my fellow Finns. So please have a look at your diaries, 16th to 18th of July, and let's hope that some of you can travel over there. Thank you very much.
Can I just say, I forgot to do one thing.
Yes, Terry.
I forgot to say one thing. That slide presentation was put together for me by Martin Green, past national president. I can see him on my screen now, and I must thank him because he's done a fantastic job for me putting all those photographs together.
Wonderful. Well, okay. I think they're just not sure what happened to Asa there. I apologise. It seems to have gone. Perhaps a final round of applause for Terry.
Absolutely.
And hopefully we shall see you all in a couple of weeks' time for our virtual supper. Thank you so much for joining, and see you all soon.
Thanks very much, guys. Great to see you.
Thanks, Terry. Well done, Terry. Good evening.
Well done, Terry. Great evening, everybody.
Cheers, guys.
Great evening.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, all. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys. Thanks for joining me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, guys. Oh, I see Howard's got his car behind him. Bye, guys. Thanks for joining me. Hi, David. Hi, Bernard. Another Bentley over. Hi, Bernard. Nice to see you.
Terry, do you remember what bike you managed to struggle up the stairs into Keynsham?
Yes, it was the Quadrant.